And now Russia has launched a major aerial bombardment against Ukrainian infrastructure targets as talks between the U.S. and Ukraine in Florida is set to enter the third day. Overnight, Russia launched 653 drones and 51 missiles, most of which were downed, authorities said. One strike hit a railway hub at the town of Fastiv outside Kyiv, destroying the main station building and damaging rolling stock. President Volodymyr Zelensky said the attack had been meaningless from a military point of view and the Russians could not have been unaware of it. Earlier, U.S. and Ukrainian negotiators urged Russia to show serious commitment to long-term peace after talks in Moscow failed to produce a breakthrough. Russian President Vladimir Putin is continuing his two-day visit to India. He's holding talks today with the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The Trump administration is said to be watching the meeting closely as the U.S. president has accused India of financing Russia's war on Ukraine by buying its oil and is putting pressure on Delhi to stop doing this. In August, Washington imposed 50% sanctions on Indian exports. Correspondents say it's a tightrope walk for Mr. Modi as he tries to balance ties with an age-old ally, Russia, and the West, and not to mention the possibility of a U.S.-India trade deal, which has remained elusive so far.
As
for India's purchases or purchase of energy resources from Russia, well, I would like to note and have already mentioned this publicly once. The U.S. itself still buys nuclear fuel from us for its own nuclear power plants. That is also fuel, uranium for the reactors operating in the United States. If the U.S. has the right to buy our fuel, why shouldn't India have the same privilege? This question deserves thorough examination, and we stand ready to discuss it, including with President Trump.
Your Excellency, my friend Rashtrapati Putin.
Your Excellency, my friend Vladimir Putin, distinguished business leaders from Russia and India, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the India-Russia Business Forum. I am very pleased. I believe that President Putin has proposed a very important initiative by bringing such a large delegation to today's event. I wholeheartedly welcome you all, and it is a great honor for me to be among you. On behalf of India, I would like to express my special gratitude to my friend, President Putin, for participating in this forum and sharing valuable ideas. Simplified, predictable mechanisms are being created. Negotiations have begun on the conclusion of a free trade agreement between India and the Eurasian Economic Union. As has already been said today, as friends we are working in various areas, which Mr. Putin has just mentioned. We can achieve very significant goals in a very short time, whether it's business or diplomacy. The foundation of any partnership is mutual trust. In India-Russia relations, this is the greatest strength.
Officials from the United States and Ukraine have begun their third straight day of talks in Miami Saturday, with the White House saying the two sides agreed that real progress would depend on Russia's willingness to end the war. President Donald Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner have been meeting top Ukrainian negotiator Rustem Umerov and Andriy Khanatov, the chief of staff of Kyiv's armed forces. The talks come after Witkoff and Kushner met Russian President Vladimir Putin at the Kremlin on Tuesday to discuss a U.S. plan to end the conflict, but Moscow rejected parts of the proposal. The U.S. and Ukrainian officials also agreed on the framework of security arrangements and discussed necessary deterrence capabilities to sustain a lasting peace. Well, joining me now is Dr. Kari Odermann. She will be analyzing the latest from the U.S.-Ukraine talks, with Witkoff and Kushner at the forefront of the talks. Good to have you this weekend. Now, let's talk about the conflict of interest here. There are a lot of people talking about Kushner being at the forefront of this. How do you respond to critics who say Steve Witkoff's business ties to Russia compromises his role in the U.S.-Ukraine talks? And what measures are in place to prevent conflicts of interest here?
We're having technical difficulties on my side. I know that what we had
planned on speaking about today. So I'll be giving a little bit of a commentary here, one-sided, from the situation with Steve Witkoff's business ties in the United States and his credibility. If someone was to critically address the situation and ask about how effective Witkoff can be, because it's not sure where his alliances are, I would say that that is a very realistic concern to have. Steve Witkoff has links to Russian oligarchs and oligarch adjacent networks, and this criticism comes from the perception of integrity issues. And right now we're looking at these recently released US national security strategy. And Witkoff is actually the physical embodiment of this, what he is doing in Russia, because what this new US security strategy's core issues are for Ukraine is to end the war quickly, to restore strategic stability, and to free up more bandwidth for the United States, while all monetizing the reconstruction of Ukraine. So we have to now look at this from the angle that the United States is no longer a global force for freedom, but it's a country that's focused on reducing migration and its own borders and no longer passing judgment on authoritarianism. So the situation has greatly changed, and those of us observing the situation have to adjust our expectations.
Diplomatic amateur, if this is a diplomatic amateur hour, is the involvement of businessmen like Witkoff and Kushner in high-stakes diplomacy a recipe for disaster? And what are the risks of prioritizing personal relationships over seasoned diplomatic expertise?
I'm going to have to assume that you're asking me about Kushner and Witkoff's role and their business dealings and legitimacy of the negotiations. Again, we're having some technical difficulties. We have to consider that what's at stake having businessmen conduct diplomacy. The answer is very, very easy. It's lives. We're looking at business calculus being applied to global politics. And alone in a recent study from the Lancet, in the next 5 years, over 14 million people will die because of the dismantling of US aid. And both Witkoff and Kushner, who is the president's son-in-law, are approaching geopolitical decisions that will affect people well beyond the borders of the United States, and in a way that they're looking at it only from a business aspect. Now, what is a disconnect here is if they're negotiating a transactional way, you have to look at their mandates for actually doing these negotiations. And although Witkoff has a presidential appointment as a special envoy, there is no record of him withdrawing a federal salary for this, and he reportedly is also covering all of his travel costs on his own. Jared Kushner is attending these negotiations purely as a volunteer with absolutely no political mandate. So on the one hand, if you're understanding that they're both business people doing things with a business mindset, you have to ask yourself, what is then the benefit to them if they're not getting paid to do what they're doing? And this underscores the criticism and makes people very wary that there is benefit for both of these men individually and their extended network as part of these negotiations. And we see also Vladimir Putin is kind of walking in lockstep with President Trump. He has elbowed out one of his top diplomats, Sergei Lavrov, and replaced him in these negotiations with Kirill Dmitriev. So we have businessmen on all sides that might not understand the human repercussions for these negotiations, and professional diplomats are being looped out. I don't know if it's a coincidence that both in Kyiv and in Moscow, the US has not appointed new ambassadors. So these negotiations are taking place without any type of record through back channels with no experienced diplomats or trained negotiators trying to create a lasting deal.
Basically move to my third question now, which is about frozen assets. Now, should the EU use Russia's frozen assets, which are the $180 billion at Euroclear, to fund Ukraine's reconstruction, and what are the potential consequences for global financial stability? Talking about the EU $180 billion Euroclear.
Okay, that's a really good point. It's good to hear. And it's good to hear you now. There are a lot of repercussions to what could happen. We have to take a step back, though, and look at the EU's reaction and this entire situation around this 180 billion as the perfect example to show that the EU was constructed to function in peace and not in conflicts. And guarantees have globally, in global politics, lost meanings, even above amongst allies. The issue is there was the idea, if you break it, you buy it, which was going to then freeze the Russian assets, commandeer them basically, and make Russia pay for the destruction of Ukraine. The issue is a majority of these funds, this 180 billion plus what you mentioned, is in Brussels. And at Euroclear, the Prime Minister of Belgium last week put his foot down and said that he would not allow anyone to take Russia's funds to rebuild Ukraine. And the question is why? And it's because he is afraid that his country would be made liable if Russia would sue, even though EU members did offer to carry some of that liability and provided some sort of guarantees. This was not enough for the Belgian Prime Minister. And what we have now is this perfect example of what I would call an asymmetry of legal constraints. You have on the one side, well, it's a misalignment of values and expectations. On the one side, there are the Russians who treat law as a tool and something that can be broken. And on the other side, you have the Europeans that are still pushing their value system that sees laws as a constraint. So the outright confiscation of this money from Euroclear is now off the table. And a softer version, which takes the windfall or the interest from this money in this bank and allows Ukraine to use it for reconstruction, which is about 3 to 4 billion a year. Plus, there's a deal that's looking at using this money to back up loans. Now, 3 to 4 billion a year in the windfall isn't a lot when you look at the hundreds of billions that's estimated to rebuild Ukraine. At the same time, there is precedence for this, and the Ukraine could take out loans. The last loans repaid to the United States after World War II was in 2006 by the UK. So this might be a deal to use those assets to back up loans, and it might just take a really long time for Ukraine to pay them back.
I'm going to ask you this question before I let you go. Now, EU strategic autonomy is what I want to, bring to the fore here. Now, is the EU's slow adaptation to Ukraine-Russia conflict a sign of its inability to exert strategic autonomy in global affairs? And how will this impact its global influence?
Yeah, it is a sign of that. And like I had said, the EU was obviously designed for function in peacetime. And it has been very hard to build consensus and build an agreement on actually what threat perceptions are. The EU has been very, very comfortable allowing the US to take the lead. And now that the US, in written form with their new security strategy, has pulled back, the EU is going to have to step up. But we're looking at it taking them 5 to 7 years, so up until early 2030, for them to really be able to back up anything with military power, which is going to become more and more important as the geopolitical situation is being reshuffled. So the EU in the short term may be losing relevance. It may be able to come back in 5 to 7 years, but the real question is what's going to happen in those 5 to 7 years. Any peace that the United States negotiates for Ukraine with Russia is going to require security guarantees. And the United States has made more than clear historically with the Budapest Memorandum, Minsk, the annexation of Crimea, along with Europe, that they're not actually willing to put security guarantees that really have a bite and can be enforced to protect Eastern Europe and other countries bordering Russia. So if Russia makes a move in the next 5 years, the EU is going to have its hands full.
All right, then thank you so much, Dr. Kari Odermann, for the patience and the time on the show. She is a global affairs expert from Cairo. We had to connect live there.